Good morning, everybody, and welcome to episode 16 of the Daily Grind. My name is Michael Price, and I'm going to be your host. And today we are going to be talking about the law of non-contradiction. If you haven't been here for the last few episodes, first we covered the rules of engagement, which is how we're going to interact with each other in the future on this podcast when we do so in a public venue, so we can have discussions that lead us into greater knowledge of whether the truth exists, what the truth is, and how we can grow together as a community and learn to apply the knowledge that we learn, the methodology that we learn here to our daily lives. After that, we went into the law of reality, which says that all basically anything that is real is all things that exist. And the word exists there meaning anything that can be bound by the laws of logic. Then we went in, and that would be episode 14, by the way, for anyone who's trying to look up to find more about the law of reality. Now, this is not some universally accepted axiom. What I mean by that is we don't spend our time, at least I don't spend my time on this show talking about the theoretical so much as what is already observable. So an axiom is a conceptual idea it's a tool in order to try to understand something. Reality is not an axiom. Reality just exists, and any attempt to deny it shows that you're using reality itself. The same is true of identity. Anytime you try to identify something, you prove that reality exists and that that thing is identifiable. And any statement to try to prove otherwise, once again, is self-refuting, causing the same issue. So based on those two, and I'm sure there will probably be someone at some point in time who wants to challenge that idea, but it doesn't even really require a refutation because you have to use the law in order to try to disprove the law. And for those who didn't understand that, I just want you to take some time on those two. The law of reality, like I said, you can find in episode 14. The law of identity, you can find in episode 15. And just try to refute those. Try to find a way that they're not true without, switching your terms or definitions. Try to test them and see if they hold. I think if you spend a little time, you'll recognize that any attempt to do so is actually self-defeating because you will rely on something real and a statement of identity in order to try to disprove either one. All right, and now that we're on to non-contradiction, I'll talk about it a little bit more. But before we do, this podcast is correlated with a book series called Burden of Proof, which you can find at burdenofproof.co. That's going to take you to the shop page on my website. If you see the flaw underneath, it's going to have an add to cart button, but it'll say $0 on that. So if you click it and click a couple more buttons, you won't actually have to give any information at all. You can download book 1 for free right now. Book 2, A Solid Foundation, is also available as well if you get through book 1 and you're ready to get ahead. Now, I was thinking a lot yesterday about what we're going to do moving forward, and if we wanted to spend more time just going straight through all these laws. And I realize that doesn't leave us a lot of time to put these things into practice. We didn't even really get a whole lot of time to put the laws of engagement into practice, much less these new laws of non-contradiction, the one that's coming tomorrow, excluded middle, identity, reality. And so after we get this one and tomorrow's episode wrapped up, what we're going to do the day after that is to maybe do some reaction videos. Actually start seeing how this material allows us to recognize patterns in real time. so that when we're in a situation, in a discussion in our daily lives, not just on this podcast as well, but in our daily lives, we'll learn to see when a term has been switched, a definition has been changed, when they didn't distinguish their terms and so they're talking past each other. We'll learn when they're applying hedging at a point when it's gone too far and it's time to cut the conversation off. It's when it's time to give them more time to explain themselves, because some people take a roundabout way to get to their point, and so on. So we'll probably spend the first few of those episodes focusing on the laws of engagement. Maybe we'll talk about the law of reality, identity, non-contradiction, and excluded middle some as well. That may get more into next week, because all of this knowledge, it doesn't really do anyone any good if you never get the opportunity to apply it. And you're never going to get the opportunity to apply it if we don't first take the time to put it into practice one step at a time, because there's a lot of steps in this process, and anyone who tries to pretend that there isn't is probably skipping a few. And anyone who thinks you form a habit just by knowing something probably doesn't recognize what their habits actually are. So a habit is formed by repetition, and we definitely want to develop the types of habits that allow us to interact with each other in a way that's easily communicable, so we're not constantly talking past one another and getting frustrated. So today, like I said, we're going to get into non-contradiction. If you want to check out the previous images to see what the laws from the prior days were, that's episode 14, Law of Reality, and episode 15, Law of Identity. Give me just a moment. I'm going to see if I can pull up the slide for today. All right. Now, if you're on Facebook, you're not going to be able to see the slide. If you want to check out that slide, you'll have to type in burdenofproof.live. That'll take you to the YouTube page. And on the YouTube page, you can click the live session that's going on right now, or it will be in the playlist probably tomorrow that you can, like I said, that burdenofproof.live, or burdenofproof.live will take you to the Daily Grind playlist. But I'll go ahead and just read it for those watching on Facebook. It says, the law of non-contradiction: two contradictory, identifiable entities cannot both be true at the same time in the same sense. So some of those definitions we used from yesterday, so I try to keep the wording consistent. So some of it sounds a little more complicated. I'll put the law simply in just a moment, but let's talk a little bit about those definitions. Identifiable means able to be recognized and defined. Entity, a thing that exists. Contradictory, possessing attributes that cannot logically coexist. And derivative, the derivative is what this law is based on, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. But so what it's really saying is you've got two contradictory, mean two things that possess attributes that cannot coexist with one another. We could go into what that is. We'll do that momentarily. Identifiable means you can recognize and identify that it exists, which means it's confined by the laws of logic. And it can't be both true at the same time. So that's not to be confused with something that could be true in one sense at one time and different at another time. It's saying at the same time, in the same sense, both cannot be true. Now, let's see here. Derivatives, it comes from the law of identity and the law of reality. So the reason I say it comes from both is, number one, in order to know that there is a contradiction, you have to be able to identify your terms. You can't know something is the opposite of something else if you haven't given those terms an identity. Secondly, those things have to exist in the first place. If you're talking about theoretical things, those things can't contradict because they don't even exist in order to be able to contradict themselves in the first place. And lastly, simply put, a thing can't contradict itself. To us, this would seem obvious, and yet we misapply this rule on a regular basis. We seem to think that actually, and we do so a lot in our speech particularly, we'll say, well, yes and no, or well, that's kind of true and false. But reality doesn't work that way. What usually is happening in those instances is someone is making more than one claim, and they've lumped them together into a singular to make them sound like they're one claim. One of the ones that pops into my head is if someone says, for example, that an all-loving God wouldn't send someone to hell. Well, they've assumed a lot of different things within that. And I'm not stating a position either direction on any of that right now. Eventually, I want to go into more material similar to that, political, religious, etc. But for today, it's that they have said that this God exists, that this God is all loving, and what all loving means, what hell is based on one theological position, and that an all loving God, based on their understanding, would never do this thing. That's four different claims packed together into one claim. And so that's why in the laws of engagement, one of those laws was claim isolation, is because if you don't separate those, we end up with a lot of yes and no's, true and false, thinking that we're actually legitimately answering one another, but I'm not actually answering one specific claim. I'm trying to answer them all at the same time, and you can't really tell which part I'm saying yes to, which part I'm saying no to, because we haven't managed to distinguish the difference in the things that we're talking about. So that's going to be really important, not just on this show. I think if we take a little time in our daily lives, we're going to notice very quickly times that these things have been packed together and we weren't recognizing it before. And try to, if you can't answer something in a yes or a no, or you can't get an answer from a yes or a no, it's best to try to guide things into a binary situation. And what I mean by that is if we leave it in maybes, then nothing is actually getting resolved. No one has any more knowledge than they came into the conversation with. So the goal is to be able to pose the question in such a way that they only have to consider one particular thing or pose a claim in a particular way that it's either yes or no, true or false, because that's the only way you're going to really be able to move forward and understand one another efficiently. So that's what I would say is the main problem that we have with non-contradiction, is not taking those claims apart or assuming that it can be true and false. Now, when it says in the same sense, I actually would kind of slightly shift the understanding on this, because when someone says, well, it's true in this one sense, but it's not true in this other sense, well, to me, that's simply to say that it's not true, or you haven't separated the claims. Because if it encompasses both things being true, then it's absolutely true. And if one of those things is false, then and it requires both in order to be true, then in that case it would be false. There is no true in one sense, not true in another sense. The thing is, the claim is either true or it's not true. And we'll get into more about that concept a little bit tomorrow. I don't think we're going to overcomplicate it or go really long today. I think we've thoroughly addressed what the law of non-contradiction is. So, simply put, once again, a thing cannot contradict itself. It cannot be both true and false. Another one that people like to talk about is, what is it, Schrodinger's cat, and it's not really necessarily about, let me rephrase. Schrodinger's cat was actually come up with as a mockery for, I believe it was the Copenhagen interpretation, to say that a thing can be both basically spinning up and spinning down until you observe it, that both are happening at the same time and in the same sense. And so Schrodinger comes up with this analogy of a cat, and to show on a macro scale how ridiculous this concept really is. That if you stick a cat in a box, that cat is both alive and dead simultaneously until you open the box, and that somehow observation, the Copenhagen interpretation actually says that observance has an impact on creating reality. So it only exists because you see it. This is just nonsense. I don't mean to be rude to anyone who thinks that, but you're going to have a hard time. I don't know how you function in reality with thinking that a thing can be both true and false until you observe it, as if someone in another place can't be cooking a burger because you're not there to see it, that they're both cooking a burger and not cooking a burger at the same time. This is absolute nonsense, and it breaks the law of non-contradiction. And if we want to have efficient conversation, if we want to find out what truth is, denying this is going to cause us a lot of problems. And so this is one of the things that we're going to utilize as a very effective tool moving forward. Tomorrow, once we teach the law of excluded middle, actually this is the one probably I apply the most rigorously, and for good reason, because a lot of times we leave things in the maybe territory, as if somehow we've gotten somewhere with it, or that's okay, that the truth is just not knowable. And the law of excluded middle, when applied properly, will prevent that. So I'm looking forward to talking with you about that tomorrow. Thanks for joining in for episode 16 of the Daily Grind, the law of non-contradiction. I hope to see you tomorrow morning, sometime probably between 6:30 and 6:45 a.m. for the 17th episode of the Daily Grind, the law of excluded middle. So I hope y'all have a great day, and don't spend too much time focused on the daily grind. Maybe spend a little bit of time enjoying your day.